So, good morning. Today we have with us Olaf Steenfadt and Mossiat from the Journalism Trust Initiative. And I would like firstly to thank you for joining us. And we will be having a discussion on fake news and the fight against fake news. Um, First of all, I would like you to introduce yourself in your official capacity at the JTI. And I would like you to explain to us what exactly it is that you're doing there. So, who would like to start? Olaf, would you like to start?
Thank you for having us. My name is Olaf Steenfadt. I'm a German and I'm the director of the Journalism Trust Initiative, working at Reporters Without Borders.
Thank you for having us. My name is Bertrand. I am a regional manager in Europe for the Journalism Trust Initiative, with responsibility of promoting it with media outlets first.
Okay, first of all, could you tell us what this is about? What do you do there? What are the aims of this organization?
The Journalism Trust Initiative is an activity by Reporters Without Borders, which is a human rights NGO and a press freedom watchdog. So we defend journalism as a profession and individual journalists worldwide. And the Journalism Trust Initiative fits into this mandate. And it is basically started and designed to create an enabling environment to promote trustworthy journalism and contribute to the sustainability of our profession, which is under huge pressure at the moment, to say the least.
I have a lot to say about this because I think that in the very definition of what you're dealing with and how you're dealing with the problem, we will find many issues that are open to debate. And I'm very sympathetic towards your approach. But Bertrand, would you like to tell us what's your role in this?
So essentially, I would be in touch with, I would be the primary contact person with media outlets, editors-in-chief, media executives, and other people in charge, executives within the news industry, if I can put it that way, to sort of explain to them what the JTI means, how it works, and the whole mechanism that it represents. It is based on an ISO standard that focuses on transparency and editorial processes, so really the manufacturing level of news. So trying to explain to them how it works, how it would work for them, how to adopt it, and what the future would look like under a JTI-compliant world of news organizations.
I'm reading here the resulting standards are expected to reflect transparency of media ownership and sources of revenues, as well as journalistic methods and the compliance with ethical norms and independence. And this is a very good starting point for me, because I do believe that the question of what should we do, what ought to be done with fake news, is not very often discussed in these terms. And I think that this is a very pertinent remark, to say that the problem with news is not that somebody is just sitting in his dark basement spreading fake news. The problem is media outlets and what's their business model? Who pays for your news? Why would anybody lie? So would you like to tell us a bit more about this phrase, about transparency and fake news?
Well, to begin with, we try to avoid the term fake news for two reasons. One, because it's very, very opaque. So many people understand very, very different things when they say fake news. And secondly, it's weaponized against journalists. And this is why we try to frame it more under the heading of disinformation, which is also, I think, a buzzword in political terms at the moment. I think when it comes to engaging with audiences and building trust and then translate trust and audience engagement into revenues, probably three things are needed most. One is transparency. The second one is objectivity. And the third one is humility. on the side of media outlets. Now, objectivity and transparency is nothing new. We know this as journalists, that this is important. Sometimes maybe we don't manage, but in essence, that's, of course, what builds trust, not only in journalism, but in any relationship. I think what we are struggling with most as a professional community is humility in a very ego-driven, I think, climate and culture, I must say. And the Journalism Trust Initiative really starts with a deep look into the mirror, not blaming others for the dire state our profession is in. And definitely there are others to blame, not to get it wrong. But also, I think we need to get our own ship in order. And the JTI starts just there as an internal diagnostic and compliance tool about processes, about journalistic methods, correction policies, internal and external accountability and transparency. And as Bertrand said, it's backed by an ISO type standard, which means the assessment you do internally can also be externally certified. And this is what we believe really makes the difference.
There's really a lot I would like to comment on, but Bertrand, is there something you would like to add to this before I ask for some explanations on this comment?
I would only say that there is a lot of appetite, of course, for such foundational approach to improving the information space, to put it that way. It is a process that takes a long time to educate the main stakeholders on, but once they're in, the appetite is only growing. And I'm simply hopeful that we reach the point that there is no way back and that we reach the critical mass.
Excuse me, appetite on whose side?
Yeah, that's news organization side, yeah.
Why would they want to do that? And why aren't they doing it anyway without your help or guidance?
I think there are lots of things to say. First of all, the JTI is fully optional and voluntary. So if you don't want to do it, that's fine. And this is really, I mean, why your question is so essential. You need tangible benefits and reasons why media outlets should do it. And this is what we are seeing evolving at the moment. And there are a couple of them. The first one is just the internal self-assessment and possibility to, just run your editorial management systems past this checklist and basically just see where you stand. So the JTI is fully voluntary and optional. Nobody forces you to do this. And this is why your question is so important and essential. Why should media outlets do this in the first place? What are the benefits? And it starts with the internal benefits when you run the self-assessment and do basically the check against this benchmark to see more or less where you can optimize and just improve your editorial management systems. So this is definitely a benefit which we see already materializing in many newsrooms that use the JTI. Then secondly, when we speak about trust with communities and stakeholders a media outlet engages with, it's not only the audiences, but we also talk about more and more, I think these days, about philanthropy, about donors, about all sorts of different stakeholders that support journalism. And this is where, this standardized transparency and compliance tool and the resulting structured transparency report as a document really can make a difference. It does for many media outlets. And then I think the ultimate advantage would be, and we are, I think, getting in this direction closer, is algorithmic indexation. So today, visibility on social media, in search, and other, algorithmic-driven services we use every day is mainly impacted by engagement. And this amplifies the exact opposite of journalism. It amplifies hate, it amplifies conspiracy theories, it amplifies fake news, as you call it, and lies and hate. And we believe that this positive list, this digital signal, if you wish, that JTI provides to indicate trustworthy sources of information can really be a game changer. And this would then increase the visibility of newsroom using the JTI, and increased visibility and reach eventually means increased revenues and sustainability.
Okay, because I was thinking that perhaps one danger would be that you would end up preaching to the choir, that only those who are already convinced would engage in this endeavor. But as you're describing it, first, it could be useful for media outlets themselves, and second, it can also work as a tool for educating readers as well as journalists on how to assess news. So one thing I wanted to discuss goes back to the start of your original statement. You said that you don't use the phrase fake news, and I think the British government also decided not to use the phrase fake news. It was somehow associated with Donald Trump and his attack on his opponents, and so it very often works in a misleading way. But we do have to come up with a working definition of what it is exactly that we're fighting against, don't we? So how would you define it? Who's the enemy here? Bertrand, if there's something you would like to say on this.
I believe I would leave it preferably to Olaf.
Okay.
There is, I think, a scholarly definition distinguishing between disinformation, misinformation, and malinformation. And the main criterion here would be, well, first of all, the impact, but also intent. Is this peddled for bad reasons or just by mistake? This makes obviously a difference in dealing with it. So this would be kind of the more systemic definition of the different terminology, which I think is broadly accepted by now. Of course, from a consumer's perspective or a citizen's perspective, it doesn't make much of a difference. It's just a mess, right, we are confronted with. And this is, I think, the biggest problem, that many people think the solution is resilience, like media literacy. So the more we educate people to use media better, the more we can drive out misinformation and disinformation. And our question would be, do people really want to get educated or not? Or shouldn't we really, and this is the idea of the JTI, more drive towards safety by design? So create systems that are by design and definition are already.
I agree. But let me just point out that maybe the one thing to consider here would be that education is not just enrolling into a class. It might be just reading news or getting the news from a credible source is in itself a form of education. It makes you, it sets the standard at a higher level. So in a way, people might get educated even without knowing it by getting their news from more credible sources. The reason why I'm asking about your definition of fake news or misinformation, as you put it, is because I very strongly agree with you that this is part of the problem of who we decide we have to fight against. So my question would be, would the reports on the weapons of mass destruction be labeled as misinformation? Because sometimes I think you didn't mention this explicitly, but I think that that this is something that we have to take into account, that sometimes it is weaponized against independent journalism or against social media, even though there are cases where we have very, very mainstream players that play a huge role in misinformation in the public arena. So that's why I'm asking, who are we fighting against? what is the main source, or what are the sources of misinformation in your view?
There are plenty. I mean, I think what you're referring to are state actors that are using modern technology, digital tools, and let's say pseudo-journalism or fake journalism for influence operations to actually have an impact geopolitically. And this is a phenomenon I think we see for the last maybe 10 years or so unfolding. And also interestingly for us, where as a press freedom watchdog, suddenly we don't talk to, ministers of culture anymore, but to secret services and ministers of defense, certainly, because it's really becoming a question of national security, suddenly. I think the interesting part, and that's, I think, a riddle to most of us, including researchers, is where many, many private citizens become useful idiots for these, influence operations and the people behind, mostly state actors, to amplify this. Why would they do this? And this is, I think, really where conspiracy theories and all sorts of, storytelling instruments come in to, in the end, destabilize Western liberal democracies, but of course with intent, with purpose of external players behind.
One of the proposed ways to deal with misinformation is jail time for perpetrators. And I know the Reporters Without Borders have issued a statement on the Greek legislation on this. And this is something with which I very strongly agree again, that prison is not the solution to bad journalism. So what is, and why is prison a bad idea?
We see, in general terms, the response to disinformation broadly being sanctions, trying to delete harmful content and chasing malicious actors, up to the point, like you mentioned it, including jail time. I think by and large, maybe we can agree that sanctions are not enough. And that's true for every field of politics. And even in private life, I mean, parents know that sanctions alone in parenting never work. You also need incentives to impact behavior. And the JTI is about incentives. And in the response of bad actors to the Journalism Trust Initiative, and we've seen even statements by Sergei Lavrov singling out the JTI, the Journalism Trust Initiative, for his criticism, that maybe bad actors know they can always circumvent sanctions. They can always get their stuff out. But gaming the positive list, backed by an ISO-type standard, is much, much harder. And this is why we believe the JTI is so much needed.
Yes, this is a very, very interesting example, because if we start from we assume that we're all on the same page here, that we do condemn the Russian attack on Ukraine, but then would it be a good idea to accept the argument that our government can decide that we should not be allowed to be exposed to misinformation, and therefore we should not be allowed to hear what the Russian government has to say? I think that whatever the stakes, and even when this is a very, very sensitive issue, I cannot imagine this being a very good idea, having the state decide that these are the sources of truth and these are the sources of falsehood. So these are the media outlets that you can listen to, and these will be banned. I cannot imagine this ever being a good idea or a good solution to the problem of misinformation. Would you agree with that?
I think it's always a thorny issue. If governments begin to decide what is good journalism and what isn't, we are very close to censorship. And maybe there are a handful of governments and states in the world which might have, the right instruments and intent to get it right, but usually it will go wrong. So this is why, again, we believe in the approach to say, let's drive out the bad with the good. The more we can amplify trustworthy information on the internet, automatically the less we will see bad stuff. And this is something that can be reached with legislation, maybe to an extent, and it needs a regulatory framework. But also, it's I'm afraid to say this, a pretty much a technology question and challenge as well to get it right.
Okay. If we could come back to your mention of objectivity, could you tell us a bit more about how you would describe this virtue? I mean, I would assume that there's a fine line between exercising partisan journalism and also criticizing the government. That's not objective. That's, of course, we're always seeking the truth. You wouldn't lie because you have good intentions. But how would you describe your idea of objectivity in exercising journalism?
Well, first of all, maybe it's important to say that the JTI and our way of thinking is not looking at individual pieces of content. For two reasons. One, at a global scale, it's simply not workable to have an objective opinion about each and every article that's published. And secondly, it can only go wrong. Trying to objectify editorial content will immediately end in some regime of and sort of censorship. And this is why we designed the JTI exclusively looking at, like Bertrand said earlier, the manufacturing level of journalism. So the underlying methods and processes in place. And the logic behind is to say, if a newsroom is well organized around legitimate and transparent editorial guidelines, and everybody in the newsroom adheres to them, the likelihood that each and individual piece of content originating from this newsroom is better, whatever better means, is much higher than if those processes are not in place. So this is how the JTI works.
Okay.
Oh, and by the way, I may add this. I think the really essential element in this whole exercise is corrections. So if you have a really well-established and working correction policy in place as a newsroom, and you do correct your mistakes, this already makes a huge difference. Internally, by the way, in running a newsroom, as well as externally when it comes to building trust with the audiences and communities you serve.
It is very important to stress here that this only makes sense in a financial environment where surviving financially is in some way related to your credibility. Because if your financial model does not depend on your readers, and it depends on corruption, then you don't care about your credibility, about the blows on your credibility, about what will happen if you publish, if you put out a story that's obviously fake. And that's why, for example, in our case, it's very critical that we correct our mistakes, because we actually do depend on our credibility, because that's why people are supporting us. But this again comes back not only to our moral code or our code of conduct, or professional code of conduct. It also comes back to a very simple follow the money principle. It also boils down to who's paying for these news. Because if it is the public, then obviously you will make sure that you don't lose their trust.
Exactly. And this is why we believe when you want to connect credibility and sustainability, you need this data point to show in algorithmic distribution systems and engine not only to the general public, but also to advertisers, for example. And I personally believe the advertising-driven business model of media is not as dead as it is always proclaimed to be. I think there is still a lot of money in the system. And the problem is this money ends up where it shouldn't go. And the problem here is that's not only a loss for advertisers. I mean, they call it brand safety. If their latest product pops up next to whatever crap, it also monetizes bad actors. And this is a huge problem we wish to address.
Okay. Bertrand, there are some very important and respectable players that also participate in this initiative. Would you like to tell us the EBU, the AFP? So would you like to tell us how are they involved, and well, first of all, who are these people, and second, what are they doing? What are you doing together? What is their involvement in your project?
I will mention the Agence France Presse and EBU that have been supporting the Journalism Trust Initiative since day one, really, in helping us in the standard setting process, as well as in promoting it internally and externally, of course. These would be the two essential backers, of course. Now, the ones I will mention are the first adopters of JTI, and it has two official status, so to say. The JTI, once you've done the self-evaluation and adjustments, if needed, you have the option to publish the results of your self-evaluation in a form of a transparency report. And this would be the first step in the process. A lot of media outlets are currently working on it and will make announcements soon. The latest ones who have done this include RAI in Italy, for instance, other public broadcasters, smaller print, online media outlets, a lot in Africa as well. And then those who have gone to the next stage and asked an accredited auditor to perform the audit and certify their conformity with the JTI standard. And in this category, the certified media outlets that I will mention, the first ever in the world would be Swiss Info. In France, we have France Télévisions at the level of the group. We also have Community Media Network in Jordan, Studio Kalungu, which is a community radio in Niger, and many, many more. And many more as well who are going to announce this very soon. These are the ones that I would love to mention for being the first adopters and first movers in their own country or type of media outlet, so broadcasters, any type of outlets.
So it does extend beyond Europe. This is very important to state, because we were having this discussion with another member of the Reporters Without Borders, that there's this impression that we, as Europeans, whatever that means, should always rank better because we're Europeans. And there's a racist touch on this argument, but it's very important that we have that this is a project that also includes media outlets from around the world. So I'm happy to hear it does. Is that common? Are you connected to media outlets?
Yes, honestly, I must say that our original idea was to add a little bit of a European flavor, if you wish, to the whole debate around disinformation, which is mainly driven by actors, I mean, naturally with the big tech companies as well from the US. But like you said, smaller media outlets, really tiny media outlets in very challenging environments are obviously closest to our heart at RSF. So we really try and make sure, and we do this successfully, that the JTI is as beneficial for them as for everyone else. And this includes particularly smaller media outlets in the Global South, where the self-assessment is also a very, very useful inroads for media development. So when it comes to, identifying room for improvement, particularly in the field of editorial guidelines. This is where a lot of capacity building, which already is in place. I mean, many media development actors are doing this already, have a much more, I would say, structured benchmark for their interventions and to do this. And in the end, everybody is, just better off.
Okay. Speaking of tech companies, what is your opinion on their side of the problem? Because would you see their role as being politically impartial, or do you think that there's a political bias on their behalf?
I would say they behave just as any commercial actor would behave in most contexts, and stay out of trouble as much as they can. And in a totally unregulated field, I think what we see in terms of behavior is exactly that. I'm not exactly sure if they have a political bias. I just, again, think they stay out of trouble and try to make the most out of their business as possible. I think what's important to mention is that, and this is what they tell us all the time, is that actual journalism, particularly on social media, is only a tiny fraction of content. Obviously, the most content on social media is not journalism. It's, just private messages, cat videos, advertising, what else?
Well, yes, but on the other hand, if
this tiny fraction of journalism, yeah, but this tiny fraction of journalism on the platform makes for 95% of political exposure and the trouble they have in terms of regulatory intervention. And this is why I think the motivation on the side of the tech platforms to solve this is rising. And in principle, is that I think that's good. I hope they do it right. And the JTI could definitely be a building block for that.
So, are you in touch? Have you been communicating with them? Yes.
Facebook and Google, for example, used to be participants in the original so-called SEN workshop, which was the round of stakeholders building the standard document on which the JTI rests. So they are already, collaborating with us from very early on. And at the moment, I think a lot of attention is on the DSA, the Digital Services Act, so the big, digital policy package in Brussels by the European Commission, where I think we will see maybe gradually more and more commitments and obligations, commitments by obligations for tech companies to promote and also build systems to promote trustworthy information on the internet.
So how would you describe your cooperation? How?
You mean with the tech companies?
I mean, you say you work together. Our experience here, well, there was the Amnesty International issued a statement saying that what they practiced was, in essence, censorship when it came to very sensitive issues of our political agenda. So, and nobody ever bothered to engage in a discussion about this. We always had these very, very formal statements, which were part of the. They never really replied for comment. So that's why I'm asking if your experience has been that you've been working together well, that you have been communicating with these actors, and that you have an idea of what they're thinking and how they're dealing with these problems.
I think the bottom line is our collaboration is quite intense and evolving. Maybe it's important to keep in mind it's not the platforms, but they are very different. They're different actually in the type of product they offer, but they are also very different internally in terms of how they are organized and their culture. So this means dealing with them is, you know, very, very different in terms of experience. And also, I think it's maybe important to keep in mind that even one of those big tech firms is not like a monolithic block, but you have inside this company, you have different, obviously, tasks and departments, but also different, maybe, you know, even conflicting interests as well. And of course, that's maybe a bit difficult to navigate from the outside, but maybe also an opportunity to exploit.
You mind if I ask you to elaborate on this? First, are we talking about Facebook now when you're saying that the, or would you not like to get into more detail about this?
Not really, because I think these are ongoing talks, and also our collaboration, I think, is very, very, you know, trusted, to use this term in this conversation, also in this regard. And again, I think promising by and large.
Okay.
Oh, and by the way, I should also add, we are not taking money from big tech companies. This is also, I think, quite unique, because they probably fund not only journalism, but also academia and research in this space quite a lot. And we made the decision to not take money from these big tech companies.
Okay. So would you say that social media is one of the most important actors in the problem of misinformation? Does the social media matter? Because some people would say that this is a problem of social media. It comes with social media. Historically, of course, we've had fake news or false news, as they call them, as they used to call them, a long time ago. But to what extent would you suggest that this is linked to the environment of social media?
Of course it is. I mean, like 100 years ago, you would have your cardboard box in Hyde Park Corner and tout your, I don't know, conspiracy theories and have an audience of 50. And on Facebook, obviously, you have many more. So that's, I mean, definitely a fact. But I think blaming tech is also becoming a little bit boring by now. I mean, yes, this is definitely part of the problem. But let's not forget that still, and maybe increasingly so, in so many countries in the world, social media is the informational lifeline of many people. That's the only source that's left to access other sources of information than, you know, your autocrat or, you know, regime of choice would deliver.
Would you like to tell us an example, a piece of misinformation that you thought was politically critical and that's related to social media? Can you think of an example? It doesn't have to be very recent.
I think you can pick any topic, which I think, and this is, let's also not forget, to 99% free speech, right? This is not illegal to tell a lie. Amplification is the problem, not the lie itself. So you can take any recent topic of the past that was obviously amplified by digital means for the worse. Anti-vaxxer information, for example, during COVID is probably a very recent example. I think in terms of climate change, we see a lot of disinformation. And interestingly, I mean, this has not so much to do with social media, but maybe just they work as a mirror of society. It all ends up in, you know, these conspiracies of the big plan and, you know, the elites trying to steal the freedom from us. I think this is kind of the underlying message you see everywhere, destabilizing our, you know, democratic institutions and you know, lifestyle.
Yes, On the other hand, the fact that someone may be paranoid doesn't mean that nobody's after you. I mean, that sometimes it might actually be true that
Yes.
there are oligarchs with invested interests in the media. So
definitely. I mean, if you talk to there have been more and more researchers looking into conspiracy theories, and the first thing they would tell you is that some of the conspiracies are true, or in most cases, there's at least a grain of truth in every conspiracy theory.
well, first of all, we have secret services, so that means that no one can, no one in their right mind can say that politics is exercised on a surface level. We know it is not. So that's a good starting point. So we know that not everything is transparent. So let me give you an example, if I may, a Greek example from my experience here in our country, dealing with the pandemic. Our government has been very keen on fighting against COVID deniers and people who would not wear their masks in public and all that. And eventually, we realized that there was important, substantial scientific research pointing out that we knew why people have died in our country, and the problem had to do with our healthcare much more than with COVID deniers. And when these people demonstrated on the street, there was only a handful of them. So at that point, it became clear to me that these people, which of course existed, but they were not part of a real problem of why the government could not deal with the pandemic efficiently. They were used as a propaganda tool to say that these are these crazy people who are telling you that COVID is not a problem, that they were talking about the pandemic and all that, and that is why we cannot apply our politics. We cannot deal with the pandemic. And as the scientific research came into light, we realized that this was not true. So I was thinking that this was a very clear example of the ideological weapon of fake news used against people who were just voicing some sensible criticism against the government, the way our government dealt with the pandemic. And that's why I'm asking about social media, because the idea of fake news sometimes, I'm not saying that I'm assuming that we all want real news rather than fake news, and that's not up for debate. But my problem when people talk about social media as part of the problem is that even when it might be part of the problem, it is also the only place where you can criticize the government, because, as you know, in the Reporters Without Borders, most mainstream media are being funded by our government. So I'm just trying to point out that when we're talking about social media, I understand that this is an environment when somebody can spread a crazy conspiracy theory with the Pizzagate or Hillary Clinton or whatever. But also, there are many instances where this is part of the solution, not the problem itself. So what's your take on this?
Well, I would say, to summarize, and maybe also getting back to the beginning of our conversation, that independent, powerful journalism is probably part of the solution. And the problem is that exploiting technology and exploiting also weaknesses in our societies, in our institutions and regulatory system requires a lot of money and resources. And the problem is usually governments and also other actors like oligarchs do have these resources at hand to use these instruments to advance their whatever goals they have. And if journalism is not in a position, because it's more and more precarious, lacking means and resources and funding, to call it out and to provide the fourth estate and check on those in power, and reveal their maybe hidden agenda and their affiliated interests, then we are exactly ending up in a situation I think we are seeing in many countries.
Okay. You also talked about humility, and I would like to ask you what exactly you mean by this. How is this? I'm assuming you don't care about personal ethics. You were still talking about journalism. So how would you find this in a way that's useful for the way we practice journalism?
Well, by starting to say it's not enough any longer to state, trust me, I'm a journalist.
Okay.
But I
don't think it works in any case.
But it did for many, many years and decades, maybe, and yes. not any longer, right? So you have to earn the trust to begin with, and not blame everything that you encounter as a grievance on somebody else. I mean, that's probably the case not only for journalism, but for just human life. But I think in our profession, that's definitely a question that's maybe new to the table to ask, like, are we really sticking to our professional norms, and what happens if we don't? And the JTI is providing an answer to this.
Okay. I think this is about all I had in mind that I'd like to discuss. Is there something that you would like to add before we wrap this up? Bertrand, is there something you would like to add?
Nothing in particular. I keep following Journalism Trust Initiative because we will make announcements soon in Greece.
Can I ask for more about this, or is it too early for you to?
It's too early. Yes.
Too early. Okay, but we will be hearing more, and so we'll be in touch.
Indeed.
Okay, Olaf, is there something you would like to add?
I think these are very, very dire times in many, many ways. But if you work for an NGO like RSF, you have to be an optimist. I think we are, and see also a lot of opportunities to really use the momentum and really improve journalism for the better, not only of journalists, but also for all of us as humanity.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for our conversation. It was lovely to have you with us at the Press Project. Bye-bye.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.